of the conversation where Richard Grove is describing a Foreign Affairs Council on Foreign Relations journal from 1998 that had surprisingly predictive abilities when talking about what was coming in the very near future.
If we go into the 90s, there's a very interesting document from 1998 published by the Council on Foreign Relations in the form of their Foreign Affairs Journal. It's from November, December 1998. And one of the articles is by Bernard Lewis, who explains Osama bin Laden. So I thought that'd be interesting. So Bernard Lewis's article is called Licensed to Kill, and it specifically names and promotes Osama bin Laden as this up-and-coming terrorist and how he has this declaration of the World Islamic Front for Jihad against the Jews and the Crusaders, end quote, right? So it's a big propaganda piece, and if you look up Bernard Lewis and you see what his role has been in his life, so do the grammar of Bernard Lewis, see where he was educated, see who created the Princeton school where he was educated, and then you can start to see it's the same school that brought us people like Woodrow Wilson and the PhD system from Prussia. And so when you understand who the authors of these documents are in 1998, scaring us about Osama bin Laden, then you can start to see the common membership of these authors to clubs, one of which being the Council on Foreign Relations. The second article is by two notorious characters, John Deutsch, who was ex-MIT and ex-CIA. Actually, he was current CIA at the time, Director of Intelligence, and he also had connections to banks that were involved with 9/11 insider trading. The other author of the article is Philip Zelikow, who at that time had been a co-author with Condoleezza Rice on a book about Germany's rebuilding after World War II. And after writing this article a few years later, he became the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. Now, if you let me browse through this article, and I'm just going to read words that I've highlighted, it'll kind of give you an idea of what they're trying to create between these two articles. The first one specifically mentioning Osama bin Laden and that he's out to get the Jews, quote unquote. That's the quote that they're quoting bin Laden, right? That he has this declaration against the Jews and the colonists. In this article on catastrophic terrorism by Deutsch and Zelikow, they talk about, quote, weapons of mass destruction, the legacy of Hollywood and Tom Clancy and nightmarish scenarios, the World Trade Center. 5 lines below that, like Pearl Harbor, this event would divide our past and future into a before and after. On the next page, oh, by the way, Ashton Carter is the third author on the article. He's from the Ford Foundation. John Deutsch is an MIT professor and director of Central Intelligence and deputy director of defense. Philip Zelikow is a former member of the National Security Staff and also the co-author on that Condoleezza Rice book.
Folks may also remember John Deutsch, I believe, squirming under the confrontation and accusations of Mike Rupert.
Right. And so let's see. Let's go another couple pages into the article because it's quite a verbose article. I wouldn't attempt to summarize it. It does talk about the Rand Corporation and their participation in this. Again, uses the term weapons of mass destruction, and curiously mentions the Federal Emergency Management Agency would organize consequence management under a federal response plan. This present structure is adequate for ordinary terrorist threats or attacks, or even small scares involving weapons of mass destruction. Well, clearly, FEMA was even there the day before 9/11, and they couldn't do anything about it. So I'm going to, we could talk a whole episode about that paragraph. Mm-hmm. Again, mentions crisis management for catastrophic terrorism. Well, what is L. Paul Bremer's job at Marsh & McLennan? Oh, he was risk management, crisis management. That's ironic because his company gets taken down in 9/11, and then he becomes the new dictator over Iraq after they get rid of Iraqi law and before they instill U.S. law. He's there in a gray zone of just piracy where there's hundreds of billions of dollars that went missing.
That's the pallets of cash floating around there?
Right. L. Paul Bremer, he came from Marsh & McLennan. He was CEO of risk management. So I'm just going to go to the last paragraph in this article called Overcoming Disbelief. Catastrophic terrorism poses an imminent threat to America's future, but the United States can fight back only if it sets the right goals. In 1940 and 1941, the U.S. government pondered what kind of forces it would need to wage a global war. The answers went on far beyond the imagination of the wry smiles and shaking heads in Washington offices greeted the planning papers as they made their rounds. The Cold War saw similar patterns of disbelief. The notion of an intelligence system founded on photographic surveillance from the upper atmosphere or outer space seemed outrageously far-fetched in 1954 when the U-2 program was born. The films and cameras alone seemed an overwhelming hurdle. A few years later, U-2s were flying. Six years later, satellites were in place. Similar stories could be told about the remarkable history of intercontinental missile guidance and how we shared it with the Soviets, or the fast deployment of more than 500,000 troops and thousands of armored vehicles of the Persian Gulf in 1991 and 1992. Now, the context of this is, what would it take to wage a global war? And the last sentence is, America can meet new challenges, but first, it must imagine success. Only then can it organize itself and attain it. And so the whole article is saying, if you guys want this, you're going to have to organize a good story and attain it, like Pearl Harbor, using the World Trade Center. And, there's, 3 stories before, there's this guy, Osama bin Laden, it says licensed to kill, because he has a declaration against the Jews and Crusaders. So it seems like a perfect story. This is 1998. They publish it.
And that it's in a way, it's as giving the pieces. It's like, here are all these parts. Here's bin Laden, here's crisis management, here's WMD, here's the World Trade Center, here's anti-Semites, here's...
By the way, that's very interesting, because when I looked up Bernard Lewis, he's actually written on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and things like this, and he's written and done so in a propagandized manner, as was his training by the Round Table people. The same people that created Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study are the same Round Table people that control Oxford through All Souls College. This is all Cecil Rhodes' legacy, and it's still incarnate in the form of the De Beers Diamond Cartel, which basically runs MI6 and CIA and Mossad.
Well, we will leave that fascinating conversation on that fascinating note, but suffice it to say, there's no doubt that we are indeed talking about the enemy, as in people who are very much committed to the establishment of the one world order, and very much communicating what they know and telegraphing it in a way so that readers of Foreign Affairs back in 1998 would have had some inkling or some preparation for what was coming. And there's certainly at least 2 senses in which that type of telegraphing of intentions can work, and it depends on the audience for that type of telegraphing, so that the general public can just start becoming steeped in the terror hysteria, which was to become obviously the dominant theme of the first decade of this century, so that the public could be introduced to the boogeyman, as it were, the boogeyman who was just retired at the beginning of this month. Well, so from that perspective, aimed at the general population, it's just another form of propaganda. But I guess for people in the know, people who do understand that what's coming out of the Foreign Affairs Journal is obviously going to be insider-type information, well, they can start reading between the lines and fitting together some of the puzzle pieces for themselves. Because let's be clear, I don't believe that what we are fighting per se here is an enemy organization that is monolithic or is comprised of people who themselves completely know every aspect of what's going on. In fact, I think it's quite clear that even the majority of people within organizations, that large organizations such as the Council on Foreign Relations, probably don't really have a clue, an inkling about the entirety, the broad scope of what's going on, and may in fact themselves even be ignorant of the history and real foundations of their own institutions. And again, I think even groups like Bilderberg, even though they are much smaller and therefore of necessity somewhat more elite, certainly the people who are invited there just occasionally or just on a one-off basis are not really expected to be part of the inner circle of Bilderberg, and thus probably themselves have no real inkling of the extent to which Bilderberg is working through various sources and seats of power in order to implement their agenda, or even what that agenda is. Certainly things like Bilderberg are run by a steering committee, which is the core nucleus of the group, and which alone, I imagine, truly understands what they are doing and how they are implementing it. So again, there's secrecy within secrecy, circles within circles, as G. Edward Griffin memorably put it in a previous episode of this podcast. And there's that aspect to look at. So again, we have different types of propaganda, or sometimes it's the same piece of propaganda aimed at different substrata of the population simultaneously. So we have to parse through that when we're taking a look at these types of documents. And again, Council on Foreign Relations members are maybe a good place to start when trying to decode what the enemy is thinking and planning to do next. So on that note, let's turn to another Council on Foreign Relations insider, and this is Fareed Zakaria, who, well, for his insider bona fide, I will include a link to the Council on Foreign Relations at CFR.org, where you can read their own biography of Fareed Zakaria, editor, Newsweek International, because he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a prominent media personality. And he also serves on the boards of Yale University, the Trilateral Commission, and Shakespeare and Company. Well, make of that what you will, but at any rate, there's Fareed Zakaria in a nutshell, and he now hosts a CNN show called Fareed Zakaria GPS, and you can get the podcast downloaded for free through iTunes or your podcatcher of choice. And again, it's a good way to keep up on enemy transmissions. And oh, by the way, did I mention Fareed Zakaria just recently announced that, he tends to advise Obama on a personal basis.
I read something in the paper this week, a couple days ago, that actually made me, brought a smile to my face. It said, the President of the United States calls you for wisdom and advice about issues around the world. So first, when he calls you, what does he say? Hi, Barack, calling for Fareed. What does he do?
Mostly it's been face-to-face meetings. Right. It's usually organized by Tom Donilon, the National Security Advisor. What I'm struck by, though, honestly, Eli, is how much time he's spending thinking about the issues of the Arab Spring, particularly the issues of Egypt, how to make Egypt go right. What are the mechanisms that the United States has to help the moderates and liberals? It's been a very thoughtful conversation. We'll see where it goes.
I'm not going to ask you what you have said to the president, but it makes my heart warm that the president is calling you for wisdom and advice.
Although, to be fair to Fareed, he did say on his CNN blog after this story became viral that the characterization of him as an advisor to President Obama is inaccurate, because over the last few months he's had a couple of conversations off the record telling Obama what to do. I added the last, obviously, but again, this is the type of thing that if it was in another situation with another type of person talking to another political insider, well, if they wanted that exposed and made into a scandal, it would become one, and it would be on the front page of every mainstream news outlet. But of course, they don't want this one made into a scandal, because the CFR are always advising and telling presidents what to do. So there's nothing to report here, I guess. Well, at any rate, there is Fareed Zakaria. So it is valuable to take a look at the propaganda that he is pushing on his show, because, again, this is very important for understanding what is going to happen next. And in order to take a look at some examples of that, why don't we turn to a recent episode of his GPS, the Bin Laden death episode that was released on May 8th, 2011, and featured some very interesting guests. And one of them was Michael Hayden.